Hey everyone. Welcome back to the channel. We've got the hottest, latest, and most shocking news just for you. Stay tuned because you won't want to miss this. If you love real stories that matter, hit that like button, subscribe, and help us keep bringing the truth to light. James Carter stood outside the grand entrance of the Magnolia Estate, the high-end restaurant he had built from the ground up. It was a place of elegance, wealth, and exclusivity, yet something about it never sat right with him. Tonight, he had chosen to arrive unannounced, dressed in simple jeans, a black jacket, and worn-out sneakers. He wanted to see how his staff truly behaved when they thought no one was watching. As he stepped inside, the massive crystal chandeliers flickered strangely overhead, casting distorted shadows across the velvet-lined walls. A cold shiver crept down his spine, but he brushed it off. The ambience of the Magnolia Estate was meant to be dramatic, dark wood, antique decor, and an old-world charm that guests adored. But to James, it felt suffocating tonight. James was no ordinary guest. He was the owner. Yet, as he looked around, he felt something he hadn't in years, like he was a stranger in his own space. A grand piano played softly in the background, but the melody was off-key, eerie, almost distorted. The air smelled of expensive perfume and aged wine, but beneath it was something else, something rotten and old. He inhaled sharply. What was that? A waiter brushed past him, not even glancing his way. James moved toward the front desk, where a young hostess, Lisa, stood behind the polished mahogany podium. He expected a warm greeting, but instead, she froze, her smile flickering for a brief second before forcing itself back into place. Her eyes darted to the security camera above the entrance. James frowned. "Good evening. I'd like a table for one." Lisa hesitated. Her fingers twitched against the reservation book. She glanced quickly at the floor manager, Ethan, who stood near the bar, laughing with a group of high-profile guests. Lisa turned back, her smile now strained. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked tonight." James raised an eyebrow. He knew for a fact that wasn't true. The Magnolia Estate always kept a few tables open for VIPs. But before he could speak, he noticed something odd. Her pupils dilated, her hands trembled ever so slightly. She wasn't just lying. She was afraid. James leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Are you sure about that?" Lisa gulped, her throat bobbing. "Yes, sir." A flicker of movement caught his eye. In the large gold-framed mirror behind the hostess stand, James saw something, or someone, standing in the dim hallway that led to the private wine cellar. A shadowy figure. Tall, still, waiting. His pulse quickened. He turned instinctively, but there was no one there. When he turned back to Lisa, her face had gone completely pale. She had seen it too. James straightened, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Something was wrong. Something in this restaurant did not want him here. And he was about to find out why. James Carter stood frozen, his pulse drumming in his ears. The Magnolia Estate had always been a place of class, a pinnacle of exclusivity, but tonight, it felt like something else entirely. Something was watching. Lisa, the hostess, had gone pale, her fingers gripping the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. James could see the fear in her eyes, the way she refused to look past his shoulder, as if something stood just behind him. He turned again, scanning the dimly lit hallway that led to the private wine cellar. Nothing. Just the flickering chandeliers, their reflections warping in the large gold-framed mirrors along the walls. But he knew better. James wasn't a man who frightened easily, yet every fiber of his being screamed at him to get out. His instincts, the same ones that had turned him from a struggling entrepreneur to the owner of one of the most exclusive restaurants in the country, were now warning him of something far worse than financial ruin. He cleared his throat, keeping his voice steady. "Is the manager here?" Lisa hesitated. Too long. Then, a voice, smooth, composed, but carrying an unmistakable edge of tension, answered from behind. Mr. Carter. What a surprise. James turned slowly. Ethan Green, the restaurant's floor manager, stood just a few feet away, a polite but too calm smile fixed on his face. His neatly tailored suit, the sheen of his cufflinks, the way his hands remained clasped in front of him, it was all perfectly composed. Too perfect. James knew this man. Ethan had been with him since the beginning, someone he had trusted to keep the establishment running when he wasn't around. But tonight, something in his posture, his eyes, was off. Didn't expect to see you tonight, Ethan continued, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Why didn't you let us know you were coming? James narrowed his gaze. I don't need to announce myself in my own establishment. Ethan's jaw twitched. Just for a second. Of course not, he said smoothly. But had we known, we would have prepared for you properly. Lisa shifted uncomfortably. The tension between them was suffocating. James didn't let up. Lisa says we're fully booked. That true? Ethan chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in it. You know how it is. Some nights, we can't even fit in our own staff. Lies. James knew every reservation, every VIP client, every open seat. And he knew, without a doubt, that Ethan was lying straight to his face. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. And then, the lights flickered. Just for a second. A brief, unnatural flicker, like a breath held too long. And in that fleeting moment, in the mirror behind Ethan, James saw it again. A figure. Standing at the far end of the dining room. Watching. But when the lights returned, there was no one there. Lisa gasped softly. Ethan didn't react. He just smiled. And James knew, with every bone in his body, he wasn't welcome here tonight. James Carter wasn't a man to back down. If something was wrong in his establishment, he was going to find out exactly what it was. The air inside the Magnolia estate felt thicker now, almost suffocating, like something unseen was pressing down on the very walls. Lisa, the hostess, refused to meet his gaze. Ethan Green still stood before him, that unervingly calm smile never leaving his face. But James knew, he could feel it in his bones, he wasn't supposed to be here tonight. A flicker of movement caught his eye. At the far end of the grand dining hall, just beyond the candlelit tables filled with oblivious guests, a door had just closed. Slow. Deliberate. James took a step forward, instinct guiding him. That door led to the cellar. And something deep in his gut twisted with an unease he couldn't explain. Ethan's voice cut through the heavy air. Mr. Carter, let me escort you to the VIP lounge. We can talk business there. Business. That's what they wanted him to focus on. A distraction. James gave Ethan one last look, reading the tension beneath his polished demeanor, and then he turned away, heading straight for the cellar door. Lisa let out a small, strangled gasp. Ethan took a step forward, arm outstretched. Mr. Carter, I really must insist. But James didn't stop. He reached the door and pushed it open. The scent of aged wine and something, rotting filled his nose. The stairwell leading down was bathed in flickering yellow light, casting long, twisted shadows against the stone walls. He descended. Each step felt heavier than the last, like something unseen was pushing against him, trying to keep him from going further. The deeper he went, the colder it became. And then, as he reached the bottom, the door behind him slammed shut. James whipped around, his pulse hammering in his ears. Silence. The air felt almost alive, humming with a presence he couldn't explain. He took a cautious step forward, his shoes echoing against the damp stone floor. The cellar stretched before him, its endless racks of wine bottles twisting into darkness. But something wasn't right. Then, a whisper. Soft. Faint. Not words, but a sound. A breath. James turned sharply, scanning the cellar. Nothing. And yet, he knew he wasn't alone. His gaze drifted to the far corner, where an old wooden door stood slightly ajar. A door that, to his knowledge, should not exist. He hesitated. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave. But James had never been a man who ignored the truth. He stepped forward and pushed the door open. And what he saw inside would change everything. James Carter stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. The dim light from the flickering cellar lantern barely reached beyond the threshold, but what little he could see was wrong. The room beyond the door was too large, stretching into a darkness that didn't seem natural. The air was thick, stale, carrying a scent that wasn't just rot, it was something deeper, older, something forbidden. His heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run. But something pulled him forward. As he stepped inside, the door creaked behind him, but he kept moving. The stone walls were covered in faint markings, symbols etched with precision, not by accident, but with intent. Strange, curved lines that twisted into shapes that made his stomach churn the longer he looked at them. And then he saw it. At the center of the room, a chair. Old. Wooden. Worn down by time and use. Thick, rusted chains were fastened to its arms and legs, their links blackened as if burned. The floor beneath it was stained, the dark patches seeping deep into the stone. James swallowed hard, his pulse roaring in his ears. This wasn't just a cellar. This was something else. Something designed to hold something in. He took another step, and then the whispering returned. Except this time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind him. James spun around, his breath hitching. But the doorway he had just walked through. Gone. The room had changed. The door had vanished, replaced by solid stone, as if it had never existed. The air grew colder, and the whispering grew louder, closer, overlapping voices blending into a chorus of something that wasn't quite human. James staggered back, his mind scrambling for logic. His breath came in sharp gasps, his fingers clenched into fists. Who's there? His voice was steady, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Then, a single, sharp creak. His head snapped toward the chair. It had moved. The chains rattled, trembling against the air, as if something unseen was trying to break free. James backed up, his heart slamming against his ribs. The walls seemed to shift, the symbols glowing faintly, pulsing with a slow, sickening rhythm. The whispering became a low, guttural growl, rising from the depths of the room itself. And then, it spoke. Not in words. Not in sound. But in a feeling. A crushing weight in his chest, a presence that wasn't supposed to exist in this world. You were never meant to find this place. James gasped, his knees nearly buckling. The chains on the chair snapped one by one. And whatever had been trapped here, was no longer bound. James Carter couldn't move. The air in the cellar had thickened, pressing against his chest like invisible hands, squeezing the very breath from his lungs. His pulse thundered in his ears, his body frozen between fight and flight, but neither option seemed possible. The chains lay shattered on the stone floor, the rusted metal still trembling, as if whatever had been bound was still shaking off the weight of centuries. And then, the chair creaked. Slowly. Deliberately. As if something was rising from it. But the chair was empty. Yet, James felt it. Something was there, something unseen, something ancient. He could hear its breath, slow and unnatural, filling the room with a sound that made his stomach twist. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't listen. Then came the first movement. A shift in the shadows. A blur just beyond his vision. His breath hitched as he realized that the darkness itself was moving, coiling, expanding, stretching. The markings on the walls flared to life, the ancient symbols pulsing with a sinister glow, their meaning lost to time. And then, it spoke again. Not in sound, but in feeling. An overwhelming force invaded his mind, pressing against his thoughts, flooding him with images he couldn't understand. He saw a time before time. A city, not built by men, but by something else. Monolithic structures piercing the sky, carved with the very symbols that surrounded him now. A throne, taller than any building, resting beneath a sky that churned with colors he didn't recognize. And then, a figure. Not human. Not even close. It sat upon the throne, its form shifting, fluid yet solid, its very presence an insult to reality. It had no face, yet James could feel its gaze upon him, burrowing deep into his soul. You have come too close. The words echoed in his skull, not as sound, but as truth. James staggered back, clutching his head. The images were too much, too vast, as if his mind was being forced to hold knowledge it was never meant to comprehend. His vision blurred. The room tilted. And then, the ground cracked beneath him. Something was rising. The stone trembled underfoot, deep, jagged fissures splitting outward from where the chair had once stood. The whispering returned, but now it was screaming, voices upon voices, some desperate, others triumphant. James fell to his knees. His ears rang with an unnatural sound, a hum that vibrated in his bones, in his very existence. The thing that had been bound, was no longer contained. A low, guttural growl filled the air, and the shadows in the room began to take shape. James turned his head just in time to see the darkness become something else. And then, the world shattered. James was no longer alone. The darkness had taken form. It didn't lunge. It didn't charge. It simply stood, its presence more terrifying than any sudden attack. A towering void in the shape of a man, its skin an endless abyss, absorbing the flickering candlelight. Its limbs were too long, its fingers tapered into jagged, unnatural points. James could feel it studying him. It knew him. Its faceless head tilted, as if curious, as if hungry. Then, it moved. Not a step. Not a shift. It was just closer. James gasped, his breath hitching as his legs finally obeyed, stumbling backward, his boots skidding across the fractured stone. The thing never made a sound, but the air between them thinned, pressing against him like an unseen force. And then, it whispered. Not a word. Not a voice. A feeling, slithering into his mind like an invading parasite. You are nothing. James shuddered as an unbearable cold seeped into his bones, spreading through his veins like liquid ice. His heart slowed, his limbs growing heavy, as if something was pulling him downward. Dragging him into the abyss. He clenched his teeth, forcing his body to move, clawing at the edge of the ritual circle etched into the floor. Somewhere in his gut, in the deepest primal part of his being, he knew, if he let it take him, he would never leave this place. James reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the small silver pendant his grandfather had given him as a child. A relic. A ward. A desperate hope. He yanked it free, lifting it toward the creature. The moment the silver touched the air between them, the room shook. A screech unlike anything human pierced the air, sending cracks racing along the stone walls. The thing lurched backward, its formless body convulsing, as if repelled. James saw it then, not fear, but fury. The pendant burned against his palm, growing hot as if feeding off the creature's hatred. James didn't hesitate. With every ounce of strength he had left, he lunged forward, slamming the pendant against the creature's shifting mass. The world exploded. The walls shattered inward, the ground beneath them collapsing into a chasm of black nothingness. James was weightless, falling, his screams lost in the wind. The creature's screech filled the void, an unholy symphony that rattled inside his skull. Then, silence. James hit the ground, pain rocketing through his ribs. Dust choked the air, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if he was still alive. He rolled onto his side, gasping for breath. The pendant was gone. And when he looked up, so was the creature. But the shadows around him, they had changed. James wasn't alone. Not anymore. The air around him crackled, a whispering pressure that pressed against his skull like 1,000 unseen hands. The shadows had changed, and so had he. He staggered to his feet, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his fingers trembling as they reached for the pendant that was no longer there. The silver relic, his last line of defense, had vanished into the abyss. And yet, the thing was gone. Or at least, that's what it wanted him to believe. James turned, his boots crunching over shattered stone and charred remains of the ritual circle. The chamber, once flickering with candlelight, was now a cavern of endless darkness, the walls pulsating as if they were breathing. A shiver ran down his spine. Something was still here. He could feel it. A presence, no, 1,000 presences. An army of unseen things, lingering just beyond the veil of human sight, watching him with eyes that didn't exist. Then, the whisper came again. Not from the walls. Not from the darkness. From inside his own mind. It's too late. James's pulse thundered in his ears. His own voice, but twisted, hollow, tainted. A mockery of what he was. He backed away, his breath hitching as the shadows rippled like water, shifting, forming shapes that were no longer just vague distortions. They were people. Or at least, they had been. Their faces were wrong, eyes where mouths should be, mouths stitched shut where voices should have screamed. Their limbs twitched unnaturally, bones bending at impossible angles. They reached for him. They knew him. And then, the truth hit him like a knife to the gut. James looked down at his own hands, but they weren't his. The skin was darker, stretched too thin, as if something inside him was growing, expanding, changing. His reflection in the cracked marble floor stared back at him, but the eyes. They weren't his eyes. The whispers turned to laughter. Not from the creatures. From him. James staggered back, clutching his head as his own voice became a chorus, overlapping in layers that didn't belong. The memories rushed in, images flashing through his mind like a film reel spinning out of control. He hadn't escaped. He had never escaped. The thing hadn't been banished. It had simply moved. Into him. A slow, creeping horror wrapped around his chest, suffocating, twisting. His body was no longer his own, it belonged to something older. Something endless. The thing had won. And as James opened his mouth to scream, the sound that came out wasn't human.